Shen Joing fell in love with my maid. The two of them colluded with each other and plotted to kill me. In the court, he used his power to force my parents to leave. In the backyard, my maid poisoned my medicine. Later, I found out that the maid was his savior. Unfortunately, with me as their legitimate wife, they can't act openly. When I opened my eyes again, I looked at Shen Joing, who insisted on taking a concubine first, and nodded in agreement. Okay, but I want to cancel the engagement. 01. When Shen Zhou came over, Ting He was kneeling in the middle of the yard. According to the law, if a person seduces his master, he shall be punished with 30 lashes. If the master is cruel, he may be exiled or sold. Ting He straightened his back with determination and no regrets on his face. I took a sip of my tea and almost laughed out loud. Ting He came to me 3 years ago. When I burned incense and prayed for good fortune, I brought her back home. I used ginseng soup and pills to keep her alive and pulled her back from the hands of the king of hell. She knew clearly about my friendship with Shen Joing, but he stabbed me in the back and betrayed me together with Shen Joing. Although I hate Shen Joing, Ting He's behavior makes me even more heartbroken. So my mother punished Ting He severely, but I didn't say anything. In order to remind myself of the humiliation of betrayal today, I suppressed the discomfort in my heart and sat in front of her, wanting to see her face clearly. Ting He is good-looking, with fair skin, and her slender neck is not drooped at this moment. Kneeling under the scorching sun, she was sweating profusely, which made her look even more charming. No wonder she caught Shen Joing's eye. My eyes turned cold, and I looked at Shen Joing, who was rushing over with murderous intent in his eyes. Mr. Shen is here. I felt a slight pain in my heart, but it didn't show on my face. Shen Joing didn't even look at me. He strode to Ting He and pulled her up. Jiang Tan, how did you become like this? He couldn't hide his disgust. You have a heart of a snake and a scorpion. 02. Hearing this, I sneered. Serious and cruel? Compared to the woman standing next to him, I am not good enough. If it weren't for God's mercy and allowing me to live again, how could I have seen my parents again and reverse my decline? In the previous life, Shen Joing also hung out with Ting He after getting engaged. When I found out, he didn't feel sorry at all, and even demanded that I either marry into the Shen family with Ting He or break off the engagement. At that time, for the sake of Jiang family's reputation and Shen Joing's, I had no choice but to accept the humiliation. Who knew that he and Ting He had known each other for a long time? When Shen Zhou was captured during the suppression of bandits, he escaped with the help of Ting He. However, Ting He was poisoned by the bandits and thrown at the foot of the mountain. Finally, he followed the refugees to Beijing with great difficulty. It was only because Shen Joing made a slip of the tongue and said that he was a descendant of the Shen family, a first-rank martial marquis. All Ting He wanted was Shen Joing's family background. But in the end, I interfered and she had no choice but to work as my maid as a way out. Unexpectedly, the two met by accident. Just like in the storybook, Shen Joing and she were friends who shared weal and woe, and with their secret feelings for each other, the two of them kept making small moves as if they were breaking through worldly shackles. And I became the stick that broke up the couple. After enduring humiliation and marrying into the Shen family, Ting He went from being a dowry maid to a concubine and a mistress, and after giving birth to a child, she became a co-wife. As Shen Joing's status rose, she gradually gained control of the household and became a true mistress. And I was locked in the backyard, all alone and helpless. Ting He moved my dowry to her yard one by one. Even the medicines we take contain some poison. After suffering humiliation day after day, I died with resentment. The next time he opened his eyes, it was after he got engaged. Shen Joing was just saying that he wanted Ting He and I to marry into the Shen family together. How could my parents bear this? When Dad went to the court to report on the Shen family, Mom would beat and scold Ting He at every turn. And I just watched coldly. Good in-laws suddenly became enemies. 03. This time I didn't make stupid choices like I did in my last life. I still remember the day when my father was forced to retire and return home by Shen Joing, and my mother begged for a long time before she was able to see me. If I had known this would happen, I would have risked my life to not let you marry him. My mother, who is over 50 years old, has white hair on her temples. But he is still struggling with his daughter's marriage. I feel sorry for them. This time, I will never let this happen again. Therefore, I allowed Shen Joing to enter the mansion and let him see Ting He being punished. Look at these ill-fated couple behaving recklessly in front of me. I don't want to. Shen Joing sighed and softened his tone. Ting He is my savior. After I hurt her once, can I hurt her a second time? My voice was cold and indifferent. What about me? Shen Joing was stunned. I'm sorry, Ting He can't live without me. I couldn't help but sneer. He believes such nonsense. When Ting He was not around, she was the head maid here. 2 taels of money a month for him to accompany me in reading and playing the piano. Even she likes to taste tea, so I will find some new tea for her. Why didn't my other maids look for Erlang without my permission? Why didn't they tell others that they couldn't survive? I watched Shen Joing for a long time. He was blindly confident and didn't look like he could become a powerful official of the first rank in the future. I sighed deeply and said nothing. The atmosphere suddenly became tense. 04. Ting He's noble head lowered at this time. She sobbed softly. Miss, you don't like me. I accept the punishment. Shen Lang, please don't become estranged from the girl because of me. She placed her slender white hand on Shen Joing's big hand, and when she raised her eyes, she felt indescribably tender and sad. Shen Lang, this is fate. I have no regrets at all for meeting you. Which hot-blooded man can tolerate such a gentle and considerate look? Shen Joing couldn't escape either. He immediately glared at her and protected her behind him. Jiang Tan, you can't be so harsh on Ting He without my permission in the future. Otherwise, I will. Shen Joing paused. I looked up at him. Instead, he became more confident, with a bit of complacency on his face. If you treat Ting He better now, I will pretend I didn't see it today, and I will treat you better after we get married. Otherwise, whether you can become the true mistress of the Shen family after marriage depends on whether I am willing or not. Behind him was Ting He with upturned eyebrows and eyes. 3 years ago, this woman volunteered to be my slave. He was also the evil person who poisoned me without hesitation in my previous life. I couldn't help but tremble. The man in front of me was the one I had been thinking about since I was a child. Shen Joing was born into a military family and was a rare talent with both literary and military talents. The emperor also had hope for him. Therefore, the Shen family was very satisfied with the in-laws of the Jiang family, which had a long tradition of scholarship. Even when he was suppressing bandits, it was the emperor who gave him the opportunity, hoping that he would make meritorious service as soon as possible. Shen Joing was so sharp that he found me before the attack. Ah Tan, if you come back successfully this time, I promise that I will make you a royal consort in the future. He scratched the tip of my nose gently, lovingly and tenderly. I want Ah Tan to live a glorious life. But in the end, I died silently in a dark little house, living a shabby life. 05. Good. I put down the teacup and said to Shen Joing, I just heard that I am a slave and have a bond. Shen Joing was stunned and didn't understand what I said. I smiled faintly. Logically speaking, given the relationship between our 2 families, it shouldn't be difficult to ask for a servant, but my Jiang family is not a pushover for such an ugly matter. My expression suddenly changed, and my sharp eyes pierced Ting He behind Shen Joing. Ting He, tell me yourself, who do you want to be like, Mr. Shen? Her lips moved, and her eyes lifted helplessly. Young lady, why do you have to embarrass me? Without your permission, it would be difficult for me to become your concubine, even if I want to. Shen Joing comforted her softly, and there was a bit more disgust in his look at me. Jiang Tan, don't go too far. Ting He saved my life, so it's okay for her to be my legal wife. Good. I spoke loudly, not ignoring the ecstasy hidden in Ting He's eyes. Everyone has heard it. In Mr. Shen's heart, Ting He is his only legal wife. The corners of my mouth curled up slightly. The Shen family is considered a wealthy family, and he dared to say such things in public. Once it gets out, who would be willing to marry their daughter to a man who already has a wife in mind? This time, Shen Joing lost both his wife and his army. Ting Chun, go find the master and his wife and return the engagement document to the Shen family. Make sure to let the Shen family know what we said today. I raised my chin, and my voice echoed loudly in the courtyard. Shen Joing was the first to fail in canceling the engagement this time. The integrity of the Jiang family scholars will not be humiliated by this. We will cancel the engagement today. It was not until the last two words were spoken that my tears began to fall. It was not because of losing Shen Joing, but to escape the pain and humiliation of his previous life. This life has just begun. Shen Joing, Ting He, I really want to see it. In your previous life, you always said that it was because of me that you couldn't be together as husband and wife. So this time, what will happen to you without me? Harmony between husband and wife is a joke to you too. 06. My parents soon found out about this, and my father acted quickly and went to the palace that day to find the emperor to testify. My mother quickly collected the betrothal gifts from the Shen family and sent them back to the Shen family with music and dance. Everyone knows that the Shen family and the Jiang family are no longer related by marriage. Shen Joing and I have nothing to do with each other anymore. The male protagonist of the incident was also driven out of the Jiang mansion. My mother stood at the gate with her hands on her hips and said in a full-bodied voice, "The Jiang family temple is small and cannot support the Shen family's big Buddha. Since Mr. Shen has taken a fancy to my servant and wants to marry her, the Jiang family will help her." The mockery in her tone could not be concealed. This lady will definitely dress up the little maid and wait for your Shen family to use a sedan chair carried by 8 people to marry her. I just want to make her my first wife. Master Shen needs to discuss this with your mother. Once this statement was made, it was spread among the people outside and was discussed for at least a year and a half. In the end, Shen Joing fell in love with the maidservant beside his fiancée. Before she even entered the house, the two of them had an affair. He was caught in bed by his fiancée, and he even threatened to demote his wife to a concubine and make the maid his wife. The Shen family is really very respectable. The final version of this incident was passed to the palace, and the queen mother angrily rebuked Mrs. Shen. "You don't want a good lady, but a bed-climbing girl." The queen mother tapped her hands on the soft pillow. "A maidservant, how much do you want?" The proud Mrs. Shen lowered her head and nodded, not daring to say a word. I savored the new tea that had just been tribute, without saying a word. "Okay, go back and teach your son a lesson. If you make such a joke again, be careful about your future." The queen mother's face turned pale, and she waved her hand to let Madame Shen go. Before she left, she looked up at me slightly, her eyes filled with resentment and anger. I gave her a small smile. "Goodbye, ma'am." Then came the queen mother's gentle words of comfort. Shen Joing and I grew up together in front of her. When Shen Joing was a child, he held my hand and promised in front of her in a baby voice that he would marry me and treat me well for the rest of his life. At that time, the adults were all sitting aside with smiles on their faces, and the Empress Dowager, despite being in a high position, was extremely happy. She is old and likes to have us youngsters around. Who would have thought that after the engagement, Shen Joing fell in love with someone else and made such a joke? She was not only angry but also a little disappointed. The incident of suppressing bandits proved that Shen Joing was not capable of handling the task. If he continues to do so, the emperor might have other ideas. This is a truth that everyone understands. Only Shen Joing, under the cover of so-called love, knew nothing. No one knew why, but Shen Joing, who had always been sensitive to state affairs, became neither human nor ghost whenever he encountered Ting He's affairs. That's fine. I stroked the tea lid with the pattern of rich flowers. With a temper like Shen Joing, he would get into big trouble sooner or later. 07. My guess was right. Mrs. Shen had a big fight with Shen Joing when she returned. Shen Joing even went so far as to go on a hunger strike and mutilate himself in order to get Madame Shen to agree to let Ting He enter the mansion. In the last life, they thought I was the stick. This time, it was Mrs. Shen. It seems like they are the only two people in love in this world, and only they can understand each other. The only objection from everyone is that they are evil and must be punished. How ridiculous. I did not hide this matter from Ting He. When Chunlai reported it to me, I deliberately asked her to grind it aside. She heard it all. My hand that was grinding the ink shook, and the ink spilled on the edge and almost dripped onto my paper. What did Mrs. Shen say? Ting Chun felt a little gloating. What can I say? It's a truce now. I heard that Master Shen has been punished to kneel in the ancestral hall and has not had any food or water for 2 days. I was in a trance. Such deep love. But her eyes were looking at Ting He, and her heart might have already flown to the Shen mansion. But now is the key for her to enter the mansion, and people like this are probably thinking of a trick. So I put down my pen and said, the Queen Mother also said that even if we can't be husband and wife, Mr. Shen is still my brother. Ting He, prepare some herbs, and let's go meet this brother. Ting Chun was puzzled and was about to speak when Ting He hurried out. Miss, why do you still care about that unfaithful man? I laughed and said, what would happen if the Mandarin ducks that have been separated for a long time were to meet again? Ting Chunmei's heart relaxed, and she smiled too. Call Mom and tell her we'll go see what's going on. Mrs. Shen has always been very proud of General Shen's military achievements, and there are more than one family who want to watch the fun, but they have all been rejected recently. As soon as the news that my family was moving spread, everyone was waiting at the gate of the Shen mansion. When we arrived, there were already quite a few carriages gathered in front of the Shen mansion. They were all important people, so Mrs. Shen had no choice but to ask someone to invite us in. But the smile was forced. No longer as proud as before. I had just sat down in the flower hall when Ting He, who was beside me, disappeared. Ting Chun nodded to me and left quietly. I still sat beside my mother. As always, she is a dignified lady. Before they could even start talking for a few words, a scream was heard. Everyone was shocked. Mrs. Shen's gaze fell behind me and a hint of panic appeared in her eyes. I stood up with a smile on my face, without making a sound. 08. Mrs. Shen originally wanted to suppress the matter, but some acquaintances around her became suspicious, so she had no choice but to lead everyone towards the source of the sound. Who would have thought that after turning around the flower hall and passing the moon gate, Ting Chun stumbled and rushed to Mrs. Shen, who was in the lead. Mrs. Shen, who was already holding her breath, slapped him immediately. Whose maid is so unruly that even the master can't see it? Ting Chun knelt down in a hurry, and Mrs. Shen turned around and looked at me with a smile. It seems that the Jiang family treats the maid very well. Not only do they teach her to seduce the master, but she can also blindly bump into the master. I didn't show any fear at all. Madam, you are serious. My Jiang family has always been well behaved. Ting Chun thinks so for a reason. Ting Chun, what's going on? She fell to the ground and said, Girl, please don't ask any more questions and don't go any further. I became suspicious and kept walking. Mrs. Shen was slightly frightened and hurried to follow. It turned out that behind the rockery 10 steps away from the moon gate, Shen Joing and Ting He were in disarray. I stood there in a daze, and the ladies who followed behind me also blushed and hurriedly backed away. Presumptuous. I pulled Ting He out. The red on her neck was very obvious in the bright sunlight, and she didn't even have time to put on her clothes. They had all been husband and wife, so how could they not see it? Everyone's faces changed. My eyes turned red, and I slapped her hard on the face twice. You are so impatient to lose face for the Jiang family. Shen Joing's face turned pale instantly. Just as his hand was raised again, he grabbed my wrist and threw me aside. 09. That's enough, Jiang Tan. Shen Joing's eyes were filled with dissatisfaction. What do you want to do with Ting He? During this period, she suffered so much because of me. Shen Joing took a deep breath and looked at everyone, his eyes filled with determination and relief. In my life, I will only go to Ting He. No matter who she is, I will always be with her through thick and thin, and I will never regret it. Ting He covered her loose clothes with her eyes full of emotion. Only Mrs. Shen was about to faint. Evil, evil. After shouting a few words, she really fainted. I covered my face, pretended to cry, and used a handkerchief to hide the gleam in my eyes. Shen Joing, this time I wish you and her to share weal and woe, and live and die together. The pampered lady usually has nothing to do, but rumors spread much faster than others. This matter was not only spread in the backyard, but even Lord Shen of the previous dynasty was ridiculed by his colleagues. Or maybe Lord Shen doesn't care about one's family background and is about to marry a daughter-in-law who is born a maid. Even the Shen family's past, as roaming the streets, was uncovered. The previous dynasty itself was a place of intertwined interests, and everyone claimed to be a respectable family. Although they all started out fighting together with Taizu, after 100 years of baptism, they had already packaged themselves as people of noble blood. Now that this incident has happened, it has completely cut off the Shen family's idea of marriage. Many people came to congratulate me on escaping from the sea of suffering. I stroked the red wedding dress that my mother had prepared for me long ago, and my heart was filled with joy. Yes, this time, Shen Joing and I can finally become strangers. As for Ting He, she had already been packed up by her mother and thrown in front of the gate of the Shen mansion. Ting Chun, who went with them, said that the Shen family refused to open the door, so Ting He knelt there for 4 hours. When Shen Joing came out to pick him up, his face was covered with bruises. He must have been being tortured inside while Ting He was kneeling outside. Ting He didn't rely on me and still walked into the Shen mansion. But this time, she ruined her reputation, and Shen Joing ruined his own future. Only then did the pair of mandarin ducks embrace each other.
10.
When the first snow fell in the capital, good news came from the Shen mansion. Ting He became a concubine and entered Shen Joing's courtyard with the ceremony of a legal wife. A wife is not a wife, and a concubine is not a concubine. This is something Shen Joing can do. Ting Chun curled her lips and said, "Miss, you don't know how rampant Ting He is now. I heard that Madame Shen has been ill for a long time, but she refused to take care of her and even asked Shen Joing to take her to the suburbs to hunt and ride horses." I was silent. This was just the beginning. In my previous life, it wasn't just Shen Joing and Ting He who tortured me in the Shen mansion. Mrs. Shen was also among them. She seemed to have a great desire to control her son. Ever since I married into the Shen family, as long as Shen Joing served me in my room for one night, she would call me over the next day. She would stand at the door from the time the rooster crowed until she would wait for her to fall asleep under the moon. Later, when she heard that he was pregnant, she scolded me every day for being a hen that couldn't lay eggs. Sometimes, she would use her status as my mother-in-law to embarrass my mother in public. Obviously, Shen Joing seldom touches me, but I am the only one who is insulted. It seems that he has his reasons for everything he does. And I was wrong in everything I did. I suddenly remembered that he had just escaped from a bandit's den, and I watched him cry with red eyes. But he just scratched my nose and said, "Little crybaby, I won't die that easily. If someone hadn't rescued you, you would have." As I said this, I started crying again. Shen Joing's gaze became distant and blurred, as if he was thinking of something. Yes, if it weren't for her, I wouldn't have survived. Actually, I should have known it then. A seed was planted in Shen Joing's heart, and it was not until she appeared that the seed quickly sprouted and became unstoppable. I was a fool at the time and said with a smile, "If you really find this benefactor, what are you going to do? Give him 10,000 taels of gold, or take him to the court to serve as an official. What if it's a woman? Of course, I'll find her a good husband. Not marrying her?" Shen Joing scratched my nose. "I never thought Ah Tan was so stingy. How can she compare to the affection between you and me?" At that time, none of us took it seriously. But now Shen Joing said that he wanted to put an end to the hardship and suffering she had endured over the past few years. He has already hurt me and cannot hurt another woman. He was determined to clear her name and gain a legitimate status for her at all costs. If the person he was engaged to was not me, Hearing this story, one can't help but sigh. Such deep love is truly touching. I looked at the crackling charcoal fire in front of me and added some more. The surroundings immediately became warm like spring. It was cold for too long in my last life, so I can't tolerate the cold winter at all. I almost forgot that before Ting He appeared, he had been willing to throw himself into a flame for me without hesitation. It's just that there are too many people interacting with him in his heart, and I really don't want him anymore. 11. Winter turns to spring, and the temperature gets warmer day by day. When the peach blossoms are in full bloom on the branches, urgent news from the border reaches the capital. After several years of adjustments, the Liao dynasty has the momentum to make a comeback. Since the Shen family has made great military achievements, it is natural for them to go to the battlefield. It's just that in his previous life, Shen Joing had the protection of a noble family and chose to be a civil servant. This time it's different. Holding the post in his hand in which he wanted to meet me, he smiled coldly. The future is uncertain and Shen's father is old. It turns out that Shen Joing is not a fool. When we arrived at the meeting place, incense had already been lit in the room. Unfortunately, the taste was too strong, which let down the shop which is famous for its tea fragrance. Shen Joing stood with his hands behind his back and his back to the door. Willow catkins floated in from the window and fell to the ground. I casually kicked them aside and sat down at the table. He turned around with a small smile on his face. Please call me Miss Jiang, Mr. Shen. Shen Joing's back stiffened as he sat down, and he stopped smiling. Tan, are you still angry? I laughed. Sir, I don't understand what you mean. Wasn't it him who went back on his word and promised to spend his life with someone else after the engagement? Now you have the nerve to ask me if I'm angry. I guess it was just a misconception I gave him before. Let him think that no matter what he does, I will be waiting for him behind him. I drummed my hands on the table, a sign of my impatience. Shen Joing also understood and pursed his lips for a long time before opening his mouth softly. Tan, ever since you and I quarreled over Ting He, I don't think I told you why I must take Ting He into my house. I sneered in my heart. How could I not know this? Even in the first few days after my rebirth, I had nightmares every night because of this. Even if you open your eyes and see the sunlight shining into the room, I felt like I was still in that cold, dark little house. After I watched Ting He give birth to his child, her power as head of the household was taken away from her, and she was moved to a tile-roofed house where even the servants didn't want to live. When the baby was 1 month old, Ting He came to me holding him, looking very proud. I never thought that I could save Shen Joing at the cost of my own life. Just for power. Ting He was born in a farming family, but she was very beautiful. Later she was captured by bandits and became their concubine. When she was in despair, the imperial court sent troops to suppress the bandits. She thought she could finally escape, but Shen Joing failed and became a prisoner. Ting He was attracted by his face, but also disliked his abilities. Until she saw Shen Joing writing my name in the mud with a branch. How can an ordinary person write such a cool handwriting? She became interested. I started chatting with him under the pretext of delivering food, and only then did I realize that he was not an ordinary general. He is a descendant of the Shen family, which has been officials for generations. As for the latter, he stabbed himself with a dagger to cover his escape. It just deepened his impression of me. I will never forget the feeling of her fingertips pinching my chin, the deep pain accompanied by her crazy laughter. Miss, you are so precious. How can you understand? Shen Joing and your wealth are such a temptation to me. Ting He has gone crazy. After being robbed by the bandits, she came to rob me of everything. Later, after I died, I saw her wrap me in a straw mat and throw me into a mass grave. As I was flipping through the account book, I saw the ruby ring that was my family's heirloom. The white jade earrings dangling by my ears were handpicked by my mother. 12. I pulled myself away from the past, and for some reason Shen Joing was already frowning at me. Tan, I haven't married yet. I sneered. What do you mean, sir? Even a 3-year-old child knows that you and Ting He have a deep love for each other. Are you saying this to disgust others? Shen Joing waved his hands in panic. No. I stood up and interrupted. You and Ting He are the long-cherished wish of 2 lifetimes. With a half-smile, she moved the teacup in front of him and said, You must grasp it well. Unexpectedly, Shen Joing grabbed my wrist tightly. The next moment, he gently stroked my knuckles with his fingers. It's like holding a poisonous snake in your hand, making you feel sick. My eyes flashed with anger, and I suddenly grabbed the tea lid and smashed it hard and quickly on the wrist where he was trying to cover my hand. Shen Joing was caught off guard and pulled back the weapon in pain. I wiped it slowly with my handkerchief and threw it into the stove by the door. Mr. Shen, respect yourself. If you do it again, I'll kill you with one blow. Shen Joing's voice was filled with some pain. Ah Tan, do you really hate me like this? My chest was churning and my blood was boiling like fire. The pain and resentment deep in my memory were now extremely clear. Shen Joing, it was you who gave up this marriage. My hatred was not concealed at all at this moment. You said that you only have a brother-sister relationship with me, and that the engagement was decided by our parents. You abandoned me again and again in front of everyone. It was you who had sex with her and disregarded my dignity. With every sentence he spoke, Shen Joing's face turned paler. Finally, he supported himself on the table with his hands, his body swaying. This is unbearable. Then he allowed Ting He to go to the banquet in my place and conspired with her to seize my property. In the end, he used his power to force my parents to leave, and they could never return to their hometown until their death. What can these few words of mine mean? I didn't expect you to be so upset. I thought I could let you go, but on our wedding night, all I could think about was your face. Shen Joing just looked at me in confusion and shook his head. Ah Tan, that night was the most tormenting night for me. I actually mistook Ting He for you, but I obviously want to protect her. Ting He was a simple woman. The night she rescued me, she could have stabbed the dagger so deep that it could have directly penetrated the heart of the gangster who was guarding me. Perhaps he was thinking of the woman who killed someone for him. Shen Joing had a faint smile on his face. I still remember her crying and saying that her hands were stained with blood because of me, but she didn't want me to do anything for her. She said she wanted me to live on in her place. I listened to him telling these stories that had nothing to do with me with a blank expression. Shen Joing immediately frowned, feeling a little uneasy. In the beginning, I just wanted to repay you. But when we met again and she looked at me with those clear eyes, I knew that Ting He was actually very fragile. I can't bear to hurt her. Can you understand me? He put his hand to his forehead, his fingertips trembling slightly. I've always thought, you have so much, so what if you give in a little? But, Ah Tan, when you said you wanted to cancel the engagement in front of everyone, my heart ached so much. That's why I contradict you and embarrass you in public. Shen Joing opened his eyes and looked at me with a confused and empty look. It wasn't until the emperor asked me to lead the troops this time that I suddenly realized that I love you. My mouth felt dry, and my temples were throbbing. Nothing to say. The man who couldn't break free in both lives was so ridiculous. 13. Shen Joing, and I parted on bad terms. I didn't see him off when he left. Ting Chen said that he was looking towards the Jiang mansion from the city gate. I plucked the strings lightly, and a piece of Yongguan Sandy came out smoothly. Miss, are you sending him off? I glanced at Ting Chen and smiled meaningfully. This song is written to send off an old friend, but I will probably never play this song again. As spring turned to autumn, wars broke out frequently on the border, and the capital was not at peace either. Shen Joing sent back battle reports day by day, constantly demanding additional military pay and cotton clothes. One fight lasts for 3 years. During this period, Ting He, who was alone in Beijing, also underwent a complete transformation. She was surrounded by gold hairpins, jade pendants, pearls, and jadeite, and she had more than 10 servants following her when she traveled. Driving luxury cars and throwing money in the street, it's such a glorious sight. She was clearly just a concubine, but she became the mistress of the house. The queen mother didn't know what to say, and could only sigh in front of me often. I just pretended I didn't know, and just continued to be the daughter of the Jiang family. Mrs. Shen's illness became more serious. Her face became terribly sunken, and she didn't look like a pampered lady at all. Some people at the banquet sighed that the Shen family's father and son went to the war, but their home was in such a state now. Ting He didn't care at all, and even started looking for handsome boys to secretly bring them back home. Shen Joing, who was thousands of miles away, had no idea about all this. He still had time to send someone to deliver his spoils to the Jiang mansion. I sold them all and made a lot of money. Since you have so much free time, you should care more about the people in your own room. Most of the powerful people in the capital have a secret guard around them. Ting He was told about this by Shen Joing after she gave birth. He gave most of himself to Ting He, hoping that she would be more confident. But when I thought of the torture methods used by the secret guards, my eyes became cold. Ting He, it's your turn this time. I asked my people to alert that group of people. Shen Joing only took a part of them away, and the rest were scattered in various corners of the capital so that he could know the developments in the capital at any time. If he had told me everything in the letter, it would have been difficult for me to find out. After a few days, 3 or 2 people left the city. It was during the war, and no one paid attention. I gathered my cloak together. At this time, a large patch of dim sunlight shone obliquely, dyeing the corners of my moon-white skirt yellow. Shen Joing, you can't be a fool. 14. Lantern Festival 1 year later. Shen Joing is dead. When the news came, the capital was celebrating the start of the new year. According to the soldier who brought the letter, he was shot by arrows on the city wall on the first day of the first lunar month. He was exhausted and fell down the wall. The enemy army chopped off his head and used it as a sacrifice to the flag. Mrs. Shen fainted immediately, and Ting He was also stunned for a long time. Finally died. I sat down, feeling relieved. In the previous life, he watched coldly as she was abused on the bed. Jiang Tan, you shamelessly married me. Isn't it because of this? He threw me into the Huaxiang building and made me fall asleep listening to those noises every day. I was so frightened that I jumped off the building and broke my leg. But he didn't treat me. When I was in unbearable pain, he trapped me in a corner with a look of joy and satisfaction in his eyes. Jiang Tan, you've been in Huaxianglo for so long, but you still haven't learned how to serve others? He regarded me as a thorn in his side and wanted to get rid of me as soon as possible. This time so did I. Ting Chun whispered, Miss, I have already followed your instructions. After Shen Joing died, I secretly sent the soldier back to his home and gave him a lot of money to settle him down. I nodded without commenting. When war breaks out, the people suffer the most. Shen Joing kept recruiting people for this western expedition, and anyone who was 13 or above had to join the army. The soldier was forcibly taken away by officers and soldiers before he turned 12. If you randomly pick anyone, you'll find that he hates Shen Joing much more than I do. Shen Joing's death was a foregone conclusion, and Mrs. Shen became increasingly ill after waking up. However, the emperor, mindful of his sacrifice for the country and the fact that Lord Shen was also old, issued an imperial decree to posthumously confer the title of General Protector of the nation on him, and to confer the title of first-rank imperial edict on Madame Shen, and to make Ting He his principal wife, with a title of fifth-rank imperial edict. However, when the imperial edict was just issued to the Shen mansion, the second imperial edict arrived before the eunuch had time to read it out. Shen Joing was stripped of his title of general and was not allowed to return to the capital. The women of the Shen family were imprisoned and made slaves of the government, and Ting He executed them by cutting their tendons. It is said that Ting He was still immersed in the ecstasy of becoming an imperial edict, but when she heard the imperial edict, her face turned as pale as paper. Even when I went to see her, she kept yelling, "It's you." Ting He looked disheveled, with several nails on his hands broken. I don't understand what you're saying. I just stood outside and watched her go crazy. 15. It was you and Shen Joing who embezzled military pay, and it was you who delayed military operations. You have brought this upon yourselves. Ting He was furious. What do you mean it's his own fault? He is a general, and the military pay and pension are given to him by the court. Besides, isn't one tael of silver enough for their expenses? What about their wives and children? What about their parents? His voice almost broke. Do you know whose money you have been using in the past few years? If the succeeding general had not written the whole story in a memorial, I would not have known that Shen Joing was so bold. In the past few years, the war has been deliberately delayed, and military pay and pensions have been reported more than 10 times a year, all for Ting He's enjoyment. The families of those soldiers lost their loved ones and did not even receive the most basic resettlement fees. The matter did not stop until the secret guard explained Ting He's situation to him. But in recent years, he has embezzled almost millions. He is so bold, no wonder the emperor is furious. Unfortunately, Ting He still stiffened his neck. I don't care, Shen Joing only has so little money every month. How can he support my expenses? I took a step closer and stared at her. Then, do you know that the people the soldiers are protecting are us and this country? If Shen Joing could end the war as soon as possible, so many people wouldn't have to die. What does it have to do with me? Ting He's face was distorted, and her sharp voice pierced my eardrums. I only know that Shen Joing is a complete loser. After I married him, I wanted to buy a jewelry headpiece, but he said the money was in the hands of an old woman, and I was not allowed to do so. Since he is a general, the money from the court is given to him. Since it is his, why can't I use it? He said he would treat me well forever, but he lied to me. Ting He's eyes moistened. Besides, I didn't get much military pay. I just got a pension. So many people died on the battlefield. Who can find out how many people died? She covered her face with her hands and cried. If I had known this would happen, I would have let Shen Joing die on the battlefield earlier, and I could have been a royal consort. I was so angry that I couldn't speak. The eunuch whispered at this moment. Miss Jiang, the time has come. I stepped aside and watched Ting He being dragged out. When I walked out of the prison, it was spring outside and willow catkins were flying in the wind. Miss, do you want to take a walk outside? I shook my head. Let's go home. End of full text.